Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Ein feste Burg, unser Gott. We've looked at this particular text before. It translates to a mighty fortress is our God. It's a fairly straightforward chorale, a little bit on the longer side, fairly harmonically active. A couple of quirky harmonic tidbits here and there, but we're just going to hop right into the analysis. Two sharps in the key signature. We start on D major, we end on D major. Fairly straightforward D major overall tonality going on in this chorale. Passing seventh in the bass, and then we have B, F sharp, D, and D, which is a 6-chord B minor and root position. Then one of the quirkier harmonies going on here is what's happening on the next beat. A, B, D, and D. If we look and take an aggregate of what's happening on the and of the beat 2, G, C sharp, E, and D, we don't really have a chord that we can really analyze. I suppose we could say that this C sharp is an accented non-chord tone. It wouldn't be accented, it would just be a passing tone here, and this could be a 2-6 chord of some sort, but it doesn't really quite make sense when you could also just analyze on the downbeat that we're just taking our 6 chord and putting it in third inversion. We're adding that A, we have the D, we have a doubled root, but we don't have an F sharp anywhere, so it's missing the 5th. And it's just kind of an interesting harmony because when we have a 4-2 chord, we're expecting it to resolve a particular way, and 6 we would expect to resolve to 2, right? Like a 2-6 chord, G, C sharp, E, and D. There is somewhat of a 2 chord happening here, but with the C sharp, it's kind of unusual. The bass resolves the way that we would expect, but the overall progression isn't what we would expect. So this is definitely a fascinating chord progression here. Not entirely sure what's going on, but we're just going to go ahead and call this entire beat 7-4-2. And we also get a bit of a 7 chord after this. With the G, the C sharp, and the E, but with the suspended D here in the melody, it's not really something we can analyze in entirety here because the chord isn't intact because of this D, whether it's functioning like a suspension or just a sustained tone. It's just kind of interesting that we have this passing 7 chord in the lower voices. But regardless, we're just going to say that they're all passing tones for now. And we move to F sharp, D, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. We also have a passing tone in the melody here before we get E, E, G, and C sharp. That is a proper 7 chord there, C sharp diminished over E. And when we see 1-6 going to 7-6, chances are the chord on the other side is going to be a root position tonic triad, and in this case, that is what's happening. D, F sharp, A, and D, D major in root position. Another passing tone in the melody here, and then we have a point of contention here for what type of cadence we have, because we could analyze this as a perfect authentic cadence, but I really hear this as a half cadence, and even though you could analyze it in either of the two ways, it just sounds like this A is going to be a springboard to take us right back to D. But with half cadences in Bach, typically we expect the 5th of the chord in the melody because it's approaching the tonic from the direction usually opposite that of the lower voices or the bass, but here we see the bass being approached from above as well as the melody being approached from above. So it's kind of interesting how Bach is resolving here. All in all, it sounds like a half cadence to me, and all Bach is doing is substituting E major for E minor. They are more or less interchangeable, and I feel like I would have needed to have heard G sharp earlier to make this really feel more like a codified modulation. So I'm analyzing this as a half cadence. It totally could be looked as a 4-5-1 cadence in the key of A major as well. It just depends on your relationship with the harmony. But moving forward, F sharp is still a 9/8 suspension over the bass regardless of how you look at it. This E major chord here, E, E, G sharp, and B is 5/5. This D is a little brief passing 7th, and then we have A major, A, C sharp, E, and A, which is our dominant in the key of D, or our tonic in the key of A. Moving forward, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D, and a little bit of interesting harmonic movement going on here in the in the tenor, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, and B. That would be implying that we have some melodic minor going on in the context of B minor, and for me that's always been an indication that we've modulated. I think that there's an argument to be made here that we haven't modulated to the key of B minor and we stay in D major throughout the entirety of the phrase because the modulation is relatively short, but I hear this as a modulation to me. I mean, the melody sounds undeniably B minor like, D, C sharp, B, and I guess it does go down to A as well, but we also have B, C sharp, and D going up to the dominant here in B minor, in concert with the fact that the tenor has melodic minor going on. I do think we have a brief visitation of B minor here. So this 6th chord, B, F sharp, B, and D, is also our tonic in the key of B minor, and we get a mid-phrase modulation. And of course this G sharp could also recontextualize this chord as G sharp diminished over B, which would be 6 diminished in the key of B minor as well, but I think this is a tonic triad and this G sharp's just a passing tone. C sharp, A sharp, E, and C sharp is A sharp diminished over C sharp, which is 7-6, and we know when we see a 1 going to a 7-6 chord, chances are we're going to see a 1-6 chord on the other side, and that's what we get: D, B, D, and B. 2 roots and 2/3, but still a 1-6 chord nonetheless with a passing tone in the bass, and I do think this is the extent of our visitation to B. This is one of those mid-phrase modulations, or just modulations in general, where we visit a key and we see a little bit more than just tonicizing the chord. You could analyze this in the key of D major. This section just sounds B minor to me, so I analyzed it as such. But this could be 6, 7, 6 of 6 going to 6. We see this with Bach, do this with the dominant from time to time. Sometimes we see him tonicize the chord where we see the chord that's being tonicized before it's dominant, then it's dominant, followed by the resolution. But here it just sounds like B minor to me, and I think this is made very clear by the fact that we have melodic minor here. But again, you could analyze this in the key of D major as well. However, I'm saying we're going right back to the key of D major, and this is now our 6th chord. After our passing tone, we have F sharp, C sharp, and A natural, which is F sharp minor in root position. That's a 3 chord, 6 going to 3. That's some transitive harmony. It goes against the grain of the cycle of falling fifths, and instead of going up, it's going up a fifth, and that's totally fine. Bach does that all the time. Passing 7th in the tenor, and then we have G, D, B, and B, which is our 4 chord, G major. 3 going to 4 is a fairly normative progression. The roots are adjacent to one another, so it's a progression that we usually see following 3, if not 4, 6, or 7. And then we have a passing 7th in the bass here before we get E, G, C sharp, and G. That is C sharp diminished over E. A likely following chord after 4 is 7. Doesn't necessarily matter the inversion. We have some non-chord tones happening off of the harmonic rhythm here. We have D, A, D, and F sharp, which spells D major. That's our tonic triad. And that takes us to A, D, and E. This D is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. And by the time we get the resolution, we also introduce the 7th of the chord here. So A, G, C sharp, and E is a 5/7 chord, A7, and then we resolve to D major, D, F sharp, D, and D, 3 roots and 1/3 spelling to close out our A section. Alright, moving into the B section, we have a phrase that ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A major. Just as a point of comparison, we see a G sharp right before our final chord in the cadence here, which makes it feel a little bit more like D major in my eyes than A major, because that accidental is being sprung on us right at the last second. This feels more like A major because we have G sharps iterated throughout the phrase, right? One near the beginning and one near the end. So it feels like the idea of A major is introduced earlier on, and that's where you can sort of see the differences between these two phrases. Also the leading tones in the melody too, that does help. But we're going to start off in the key of D major, D, F sharp, D, and D. No need to reanalyze there. Passing tones in the lower voices, F sharp A, F sharp A, C sharp and A. That's our 3 chord, kind of like a substitute for 1/6 there. And then this is where I believe we modulate to the key of A major. We do have a G sharp on the next beat. F sharp minor is the 6th chord in the key of A major. E, G sharp, D, and B is E7 in root position. That's a 5/7 chord. We have some passing tones in the lower voices as well before we get C sharp, E, E, and A, which is A major in first inversion, 1/6. We also have some passing or some non-chord tones here. This looks like a passing tone, but it's not. It skips down to B here. D, F sharp, D, and A is D major in root position. Sorry, I had some brain fog there. 1/6 going to 4. And that's good because 4 is typically a predominant chord, and we're seeing it preceding a dominant. So E, E, B, and G sharp is our 5 chord, and then we cadence on A major, which is our tonic in this context. A, E, C sharp, and A. So we're going to move to the next phrase, which ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major, and I think this A major, it just sounds like 5 going to 1 to me. So if we analyze this as our dominant in the key of D, this is really the beginning of the modulation zone. I've been talking about modulation zones in my videos for quite some time now. The idea of a chord or of a phrase sharing multiple chords in common with the key that we're going to be modulating to presents a modulation zone, especially if those chords are in succession. We have movement from A major to D major, we have A major, we have D major. Really what we're looking for is a tone like G natural versus G sharp that will indicate sort of the end of the zone or the likely end of the zone, and that doesn't really happen until here. So there's 3 or 4 possible beats where you could analyze the modulation, because presumably the chords are diatonic to both pitch collections. So after our 5 chord, we resolve to 1, F sharp, A, D, and D, more specifically 1/6, passing tone in the alto, E, D, F sharp, and A. I reckon this E is an accented non-chord tone. It's this D that is the root of our chord. We're just taking our 1 chord and inverting it, or re-inverting it back to root position. And then we have G, D, G, and B, which is our 4 chord, G major, passing 7th in the alto before we get A, E, and C sharp. That is our 5 chord, A major. And then we cadence on D major, D, A, F sharp, and D, which is our tonic in root position. We have another short phrase here. This is kind of interesting. It does end in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A major, so we're just seeing oscillation between basically the tonic and the dominant over the whole form. We do get this little mid-phrase modulation here, but it is very brief. This is about as brief of a mid-phrase modulation as you can get. It's almost, it's like sitting on the fence between modulation and tonicization here. But all in all, we're basically just moving between D major and A major throughout the entirety of the chorale. We do get kind of a quirky key thrown in near the end of the chorale here, but we'll get to that when we get to it. So I think very similarly to the phrase progression between the first phrase and the second phrase, F sharp, A, F sharp, and C is a 3 chord in the key of sorry, I was drawing a comparison to this because I saw a 6 here. The phrases are similar because this is the point in which they modulate metrically, or the metric point in which they modulate. This isn't a metric modulation. That's something entirely different that we don't really experience in Bach's music. But this F sharp minor chord we've seen follow D major in the past, 1 going to 3 right here at the beginning of the B section. But I think in the key of A major, this is also our 6. We saw 3 go to 6 earlier as well. So it makes sense that Bach is using it as another device to move to the key of A major. And after our 6th chord, we get B, B, F sharp, and D. And we can make an argument that this is a 2 chord. It's very likely that this is a 2 chord. 6 going to 2 is a normative progression, but I think, and this is actually, to me, probably the most fascinating point in the chorale, just because I am really interested in these small details. But this is a subdivided progression, right? We have all 4 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm on the and of the beat here. But look what is subdivided. We have the F sharp versus the G sharp, which is the difference between this being B minor and G sharp diminished, 2 or 7. And we know that 7 and 2 are often contextualized together because they're separated by this whole step, and Bach often presents scenarios where we have a 2 chord that turns into a 7 chord, or a 7 chord that's preceded by an accented non-chord tone. And I think that this is just a subdivided case of that, where instead of dealing with 8th notes and quarter notes, we're dealing with 8th notes and a set of 16th notes. So I do think this is a 7/6 chord in the grand scheme of the function of the harmony, because it eventually resolves to 1, C sharp, E, A, and C sharp. 1/6. It seems like a much more normative progression, and you could even further subdivide this to say 2 going to 7, but to me, 2 going to 7, it's not a very common chord progression, and of all of the predominant to dominant chord progressions, it's the weakest, and it has to do with the fact that the roots are a third apart from one another, and that's just an objective fact. It isn't about sound, it's just when we're talking about tonality and the narrative that comes with certain chords and their functions, chords that are a third apart present weaker progressions than chords that are, say, adjacent to one another, or chords that are a fourth apart from one another. It just is how it is. But this 1/6 chord is happening off of the harmonic rhythm. We then get D, F sharp, A, and B, which is 2-6-5, B minor 7 over D, and we would expect a chord like that in a cadential situation. And another subdivision here, we have E, E, G sharp. Remember, the sharp gets carried earlier from the measure in B. E, E, G sharp, and B, which is our 5 chord, E major. And then we cadence on A major, A, C sharp, E, and A. Our tonic triad. Okay, next phrase. We get a half cadence in what key? E minor. What an interesting key to have introduced here. E minor, 1 sharp, A major, 3 sharps. This is a distant modulation, and it is a direct modulation, where we're taking the idea of A major, which has an E major chord in a very focal point in the scale. E major is the dominant, to then contextualizing E minor, which is like flipping the chord and showing its other side. So it's an interesting juxtaposition of keys to take the major dominant of the key that we just saw and turn it into our minor tonic moving forward. So this is a direct modulation right to E, and we're going to see a similar device used to get from E minor back to D major for the end of the chorale. So we start off in the key of E minor with our tonic, E, E, G, and B, passing tone in the bass, G, D, G, and B, which has potential to be our 3 chord. We have seen 1 going to 3 in the past, and in fact I am going to say that that is the case. This is our 3 chord, but I think there's an argument to be made that this also could be analyzed as 1/6 as well. But the only reason why I say 1 going to 3 is a likely progression in this chorale is because we've seen it a couple times, especially early on in the phrase. You could draw a comparison to the beginning of the B section in terms of what the bass is doing and what just where it's happening in the meter. But after our 3 chord, we have D, F sharp, F sharp, F sharp, D, and A. That is D sharp diminished over F sharp, which is 7/6, another transitive harmony here, because 7 typically goes to 3, down a 5th, not the other way around. But we see Bach do this so much that I may just stop commenting on it. I only really comment on it in videos nowadays because I want to stay consistent, and it's something that goes against the majority of the progressions that we see. But regardless, we go from 7/6 to D sharp, B, F, sharp and B, which is 5/6, B major over D sharp. And there's something to be said about this progression here. Chord progressions that are a third apart tends to be weaker in terms of their overall impact on the texture because they mostly consist of the same tones. And I feel like I talk about this in a lot of my videos, but without ranting for too long about this progression, when I say weakest, it's not about the sound, it's about the tonal narrative, right? The idea of tonality being a means of this oscillation between the tonic and the dominant and the journey of moving through the chords, right? Chords have a function and they basically project a roadmap that take you from one destination, your springboard, your starting point, to the end of the phrase, and it sort of gives the music a sense of grammar and a sense of structure. Like the harmony is basically in lockstep with the form. And when you see this idea of 7 going to 5, they're a third apart, so there's really not a big introduction of new tones going on here, and they have the same function. So they're both dominant chords. So when you see 7 going to 5, it's like the idea is that the dominant is being suspended, like we're delaying, or we're not, Bach is delaying the resolution to the tonic over a longer period of time. But what's important here is these passing E's here. We have an E as a passing tone here in the bass, and E as a passing tone here in the alto, and even though we don't have a fully voiced E minor triad here, it's almost as if Bach is implying an E minor triad as a reprieve between the two dominant triads, or the two, well, I mean, yes, they're triads, but the two dominant functioning chords. So we're getting a little taste of the resolution before we get in, or an entire resolution, like a fully proper resolution with a chord that's entirely intact. But we have a passing seventh in the melody here, and then we have E minor, E, B, E, and G, which is our tonic triad, like I said. So we have 7 going to 5. That's not really what's happening under the hood. Like, yes, on the harmonic rhythm, which is on pretty much every beat, we have two dominant functioning chords in succession, but in between them are these passing E's, which is a bit of a breather that maybe it's not foreshadowing what's to come, but Bach often interjects with these tonic doublings in between these chords. Something to keep in mind. But this is a half cadence, so we do cadence on 5, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp. And notice how the fifth of the chord is in the melody, unlike our first half cadence, which I hear as a half cadence, but there's definitely some ambiguity here where we cadence on 5 and the root of the melody is in the, the root of the chord is in the melody. But we're closing in on our last phrase. It ends in a perfect authentic cadence like we would expect it to in the key of the tonic, and we get another direct modulation to the key of D major here. Also something to comment on at the beginning of this phrase, it is possible that this A major is a common chord from in between A major and E minor, because A major could be the major 4 in the key of E minor as a byproduct of harmonizing the melodic minor scale, but we don't get any melodic minor here, and that's typically the context in which we see 4 being used. Very rarely do we see major 4 being used outside of the context of an ascending melodic minor fragment in one of the voices. So the fact that that's absent makes me feel like it's probably not the case. And also, coming from A major to E minor, there's just like a very harsh juxtaposition of G sharp versus G natural on either side of this E here. It feels direct, just like how this modulation here feels direct. We have D sharp here in the alto. It turns into an F sharp, and the F sharp in the melody turns into a D natural. And I believe this was a mistake that I made in one of my earliest videos I made on the channel, and I vowed to never do it again, and hopefully I haven't been called out on it yet. But if you do see me making a mistake that you are certain is not how it should be analyzed, please let me know. I want these to be accurate, and if there is any erroneous information, I want the comment section to be a hub for that. So Yes, do keep that in mind if you are analyzing along with me. But this is a direct modulation to D major, in my opinion. B minor, B, F sharp, and D natural is our 6th chord, and now we're pretty much in the key of B minor for the rest of the chorale. We see another 6-3 progression here: F sharp, A, F sharp, and C sharp. F sharp major in root position, passing 7th in the alto before we get G, B, D, and B, which is our 4 chord. We've seen a lot of 3 going to 4 in this chorale, and then we have some passing tones in the inner voices here: C sharp, E, G, and B spells C sharp minor 7 flat 5 in second inversion, 7 4 3. 4 going to 7 is probably the most common subdivided chord progression in all of the chorales. I'm definitely speculating that, but that's my hypothesis based on everything that we've looked at so far. But after our 7 4 3 chord, we have D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad in root position, passing tone in the bass, passing tone in the alto, and then we have B, G, D, and G, which is our 4 chord in first inversion, 4 6. Let's actually take a look at what's going on here on this beat, because we do have 2 voices moving: C sharp, D, E, and A. So not really an analyzable chord, but there is potential there. Like, there is some, you know what Bach is doing? Bach is permutating the voices in terms of pairing them up together and moving them. Here we have the inner voices, here we have the bass and the alto, and here we have the melody and the tenor. We just don't have the bass and the tenor moving together, and the alto and the melody. So there are some permutations that Bach doesn't explore, but you can see that he's sort of rhythmically and gesturally, is that a word? I think you get what I'm trying to say, through gesture, trying to imitate. So imitation comes in different shapes and sizes, that's for sure. It doesn't have to be strictly based on pitch, but we see that the same gesture rhythm is being used. But after our 4 6 chord, we have some more passing tones: B, F sharp, D, and A. It's kind of like a 6 7 chord in passing. I don't really think it's contributing too much to the progression, though, and that has to do with the chords being a third apart. Like 4 going to 6, not a very strong progression, and at the subdivided level, I don't really think that it would stick out of the texture unless you paused the whole ensemble or stopped playing at that point and held the chord. So I'm going to take it with a grain of salt and exclude that from the analysis. And I think the bigger picture is 4 is going to 7 here: C sharp, E, E, and G, root position 7 chord. Someone commented on one of my videos that there's some surprise, that they were surprised about the fact that 4, or we would see 7 chords in root position. Here's one right here, and we actually see them quite frequently. Definitely not as frequently as inverted 7 chords, but when we see 7 chords on the beat, sometimes they're in root position, and very rarely we see them with the leading tone doubled. But here you could also analyze this as 5 6 A major, or sorry, 5 6 5 A7, because we have the G here, A7 over C sharp. Based on how you view this A, kind of looks like 2 5 1 here in the alto. But I'm going to call this A non-chord tone. Then we have D major here, D, F sharp, D, and F sharp, so 2 roots and 2 thirds. Of course, this third is kind of brief. This G is a passing tone, and this A is the longest of the note values on this beat, so it's pretty much an intact triad. And we're closing in on our cadence. We have G, B, D, and E. E minor 7 over G, that's 2 6 5. A, C sharp, and E is our 5 chord, A major, passing 7th in the tenor before we cadence on D major, D, F sharp, A, and D. Root position tonic triad. And that is today's analysis. Some of the takeaway points is, first, this 4-2 resolution kind of is racking my brain. I don't know exactly what's going on here, because the bass resolves the way we would expect, but I don't really know exactly what's going on with this chord. Is this a B minor 7 chord? It really feels like it, because Bach takes the time to leap down to this B here and revoice it. So the fact that there's no F sharp in this chord anymore, and the fact that F sharp sort of ends up turning into a resolution point here in the alto. It's kind of interesting. I don't really know exactly what's going on, but you know, it's just one of those anomaly chord progressions where you just don't fully know. I think what's important though is that if this is a 7/4/2 chord, which I think it is, I'm fairly sure it is, the bass is resolving down by step, which is the 7th of the chord, and that's the most consistent thing that we can see in the chorales, is how that resolves. But other than that, mid-phrase modulations, or just one, where we go to B minor for a bit here, that's how I analyze it. It's not super strong as far as mid-phrase modulations are concerned. It really is just a tonicization plus. But I analyzed it as a modulation just because melodic minor tends to have that impact on the way that I hear the harmony, and I think it's grounded in logic. So whether you see that as just a little bit of B minor quotation in the key of D, totally valid too. It's good to see multiple sides of the argument. And probably the biggest thing in this chorale is distant modulation. A major direct modulation to E minor, or common chord, you know, if that A really does feel like 4 going to 1 for you, like sort of a Dorian plagal thing going on. It's totally valid. 2 direct modulations in this chorale, the way that I analyze it, which is relatively uncommon, but you know, we're seeing it here, and that's totally fine. But that's really all that I wanted to comment on from the bigger picture of this chorale, and I think I'm going to cap my analysis off on that thought. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. If you're interested in following along on the journey to analyze the chorales, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification icon if you'd like to be notified of my daily upload, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Take care.